Have you heard of Rett syndrome? And do you know why you should care about the research on Rett syndrome? I just learned a ton by interviewing Monica Coonrads, who has devoted the last 25 years of her life working in making progress in the world of Rett syndrome. It used to be part of the spectrum. It's not now, but we should all care about what's happening in Rett syndrome. And I think you're going to love this episode. At the end, we talk about if you should seek genetic testing for Rett's, when you should seek it if you have a child with autism. But the whole episode is just fascinating and exciting to see some of the treatment options that are really coming down the line. So let's get to it with Monica Coonrads. Hi, Monica. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Mary.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about Rett syndrome. And I'm not sure if my audience knows anything about Rett, but I think it's important, even if you know no one with Rett, or you don't really see the correlation between autism and Rett and other things. But before we dive into what it is and why we should know about it and care about it, why don't you tell me and our listeners about your fall into the autism world and also your fall into the world of Rett?
Sure. So my husband and I had been married almost 10 years. I ran a family restaurant for the first, right after I graduated from grad school. And I was working about 100 hours a week. So
Oh, wow.
Not really conducive to starting a family. So we put off having children till we sold the restaurant. And got pregnant right on cue with our first child, Chelsea. We had a first, wonderful year together. She was hitting her milestones and developing, like a typical child. And then we started to notice that she was doing some strange things, crossing her eyes, making some strange rocking motions, just starting to do some things that were making me nervous. And she started regressing, losing skills. We started seeing a developmental pediatrician, pediatric neurologist, pediatric geneticist. Eventually, she received a tentative diagnosis of autism. And then when she was 3, a genetic test became available to test her for Rett syndrome, which is a disorder that I learned about and that I felt pretty strongly that she had, although some of the doctors said, we don't think so. But anyway, genetic test became available. She tested positive, and she has the most common mutation in a gene called MECP2 that we now know is responsible for Rett syndrome. She initially got an autism diagnosis at the age of 2, a tentative diagnosis of Rett before the gene was discovered, and then confirmed in 1999 with a positive test for MECP2.
Wow. So Lucas was also diagnosed in 1999, one day before his 3rd birthday. So our kids are around the same age. And I have a friend whose daughter is a little bit younger, but she was diagnosed with autism first and then Rett second. And so what is Rett, like, how is it different than autism? And do we have any kind of statistics on like how many kids have it, and then how many kids have it that also have an autism diagnosis or autism traits?
So Rett syndrome is a childhood neurological disease. It's caused by mutations in a single gene, which I've already mentioned, MECP2. There's over 900 different mutations that have been identified in this one gene. And the symptoms, you have a normal first year of life, then a regression where you're actually losing skills that you've gained. That can be language, that can be motor skills. The hallmark symptom of Rett syndrome is loss of purposeful hand use. My daughter lost her hand use at around 20 months. It was kind of gradual at first, couldn't hold a sippy cup anymore, couldn't hold her bottles, lost her pincer grasp. And then it's replaced by repetitive stereotypical hand movements. And so she has absolutely no hand use whatsoever. Also, children can lose their motor skills. Typically, if you know how to walk, you'll retain that, but it's a very kind of awkward, stiff, wide-based gait. About 50% of individuals with Rett never walk.
Really?
A percentage of those that do walk may end up losing it later in life. Seizures are very common. Irregular breathing abnormalities, hyperventilation or breath holds, gastrointestinal problems, which of course a lot of kids with autism have as well, anxiety, sleep problems. It's a really, unfortunately, very long list of symptoms. It is a spectrum disorder. Not everyone has every symptom. My daughter, unfortunately, has every symptom in the book. And it's not degenerative in that brain cells are not dying. All the brain cells are there. They're in the right place. They're not working properly, but they're all there and they're not dying, which is great because when we think about interventions, we're hoping to restore cellular function, but you don't have to replace cells that are dead. So that's an advantage, but it is progressive. So my daughter at 26 is in worse shape now than she was at 15 or at 10 or at 5 years old. There's a lot of, as the girls age, they have a lot of muscle tone issues. They can become very stiff, like Parkinson patients. When they're little, like around 2, 3, 4, 5, many of them have autistic-like features. They're not interacting with their environment. They're not, maybe not smiling. One of the first clues that had me very concerned was Chelsea would have something on the wall in every room that she would fixate on. And she would just look at it and look at it. And she didn't smile for a long time. She wouldn't respond to her name. If you were making noise right behind her, she wouldn't turn around. But oftentimes those go away and the children actually become quite social with good eye contact. And in fact, they use their eyes often to communicate. And many young children are now being exposed to augmentative communication devices, which they can operate with their eyes. So eyes are actually one of those body systems that they use well and to their advantage to help them.
And it used to be thought that Rett happened, and we say Rett. I've made this mistake a bunch of times. I don't know how to spell it, so it's R-E-T-T. There's no H, which is a mistake I make, and then I've made in the past. And then a lot of people say Rett's and with an S, but it's actually Rett Syndrome, and the S is just on syndrome. So, but I used to think, as many people did, that it only affected girls, but there are boys with Rett, right?
Yes, there are boys with Rett. It's primarily affects girls, and that's because of the genetics of it. So MECP2 is on the X chromosome, and fathers give a Y to their sons and an X to their girls, right? Chromosome. And most of the mutations, there's a lot of studies that have been done on this. Most of the mutations come from a mutated sperm. And that's because men are making, billions of sperm every day, and it's easier to have typos, mistakes, genetic mistakes in sperm. Women are born with all the eggs that they're going to need. And they're not, it's a numbers game, really, right? So lots of sperm being made, higher chance of mistakes. But because it's on the X chromosome, and because it's the most of the mutations come from sperm, it comes from fathers passing it on to their daughters because they're giving a Y chromosome to their son.
Okay.
And that's why it's mostly found in females. There's this urban legend out there that I read all the time, and it's just not correct, that says males get it, but they die in utero. And that's why we don't see boys with it. That's not true. There's no data at all to support the hypothesis that, you know, boys are dying male fetuses are dying in utero. They don't get it to begin with, typically. When they do have it, they're getting the mutation from their mother, which means she has it in her eggs, which doesn't happen very often. It's a very rare occurrence. When they do have it, they are more severe than girls, because girls have 2 X chromosomes, so they have 2 MECP2 genes. And they turn one on and one is off in every cell. So they have about 50% of cells that have the normal functioning MECP2 that's making normal protein, and about 50% that's making mutated MECP2. The boys only have 1 X chromosome. That means they only have 1 MECP2 gene, and it's mutated in every cell. So they don't have any backup normal MECP2 protein. Every cell is mutated. And so they're much more severe. And so how that might present is a baby who has problems right from the get-go, right from birth, who's maybe having trouble eating, having trouble breathing, failure to thrive, and they may end up, unfortunately, dying quite young. There are boys, and we're there are more that are being diagnosed who have less severe. It could be a less severe mutation. It could be that they have Klinefelter syndrome. They have actually another syndrome where they have 2 X chromosomes, in which case they're going to present very much like girls. So there are boys that survive. But
do you have any stats? Like autism is now 1 in 36. So
yeah.
do we have any stats of like Rett?
Yes. So it's 1 in 10 to 15,000 girls, female births.
Okay.
So that translates to about 15,000 individuals in the US, about 350,000 worldwide. It's in the same ballpark as Huntington's, ALS.
Oh, okay.
A little more rare than cystic fibrosis, but still we're all kind of in the same ballpark in terms of rare diseases. So yes, we're a rare disease, but in the world of rare diseases, we're quite common.
Okay.
For boys, we don't have stats.
Okay. So it is primarily a girl disease.
Yes.
Okay. So there used to be with the DSM-4, which is how the diagnostic manual, how we look to diagnose kids with autism. Rett syndrome used to be with the DSM-4 when Lucas was diagnosed, a part of the autism spectrum. And then with the DSM-5 in 2013, Rett was no longer on the spectrum. They also stopped a category, PDD-NOS, and stopped the category of Asperger's syndrome. So since 2013, it's only been autism spectrum disorder. And one of the reasons that Rett got off of that, which was very appropriate, is because they found the gene, like you had said with your daughter. And so, like, why should my audience, I mean, I care about the gene, finding the gene. That is, even though it's rare, it's great to find the gene because there are genetic therapies. And, you know, you've been at this, Monica, for decades, right? Trying to find a treatment, cure, perhaps. And cure is like kind of a dirty word in the autism world, but I don't think, are there people with Rett or parents with girls with Rett that think Rett is a gift?
Well, I think most parents want their children to improve, right? So, I'll give you, my daughter doesn't walk, doesn't talk, has seizures, is fed through a feeding tube, has trouble sleeping, has anxiety. I think every muscle in her body aches. She has scoliosis. She can't use her hands. You know, think about an adult being blindfolded and gagged and hands, not blindfolded, they're not blind, but gagged and hands tied behind their back, and she can't even roll over in bed.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us want our children to go through life like that. And of course, all of us that have special needs kids worry about who's going to take care of our kids when we no longer can, and where is she going to end up, and how is she going to be treated and cared for it. And it's no. So I haven't met any parent who doesn't want their child to get better, their child with Rett syndrome. That doesn't mean that we love them the way they are, of course. I mean,
right. She's a gift to the world as is, as she is. And she's also a gift because you have devoted your whole life to finding treatments, finding relief. And because they've identified the gene 23, whatever years
in 1999, 24
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah. So they also have started genetic therapy in animals. And I just ran into my friend with a daughter with Rett, and she told me that they just injected a live human with Rett with something. So can you tell our audience? But I think I'm excited to know about the treatment for Rett, because if we can get a treatment for Rett with a known genetic issue, then there's going to be more possibilities in the future.
Sure.
For our kids too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been dreaming and hoping for, gene therapy for Rett syndrome since the gene was identified. So yeah, 24 years ago. And the first gene therapy trial for Rett syndrome dosed their first patient a couple of weeks ago. There are two companies that have gene therapy trials underway. One is Taysha Gene Therapies. That trial is in Canada. It's for adults 18 and over, and they've dosed their first patient. They're planning on expanding the trial, bringing it to the UK and to the US as well. They're going to be filing for, an application to the FDA. And then the other company is Neurogene. They're a New York City-based company. And they have an open IND for a gene therapy trial for girls 4 to 10 years old. They just mentioned, they just released the 3 sites. Their protocol is available on clinicaltrial.gov. Taysha's is also. And they'll be recruiting.
What's the website?
Clinicaltrial.gov. If you put in Rett syndrome gene therapy, you'll be able to see the protocols for both of those gene therapy trials. Both of those trials, both of those programs got started at the Rett Syndrome Research Trust, which is an organization that I started and that I run. And so it's gratifying and encouraging to be able to see that basic science that we funded and encouraged, and the investigators that we recruited into a gene therapy consortium have now gone on to be, industry programs.
Yeah, which is so amazing. I mean, you founded and oversaw 2 Rett organizations, and you helped to raise over $100 million to fund research, to fund, any kind of research to look at the disease and look at possible treatments. And the animal research that these human trials are based on is very strong. Like, I was reading your bio and I was like, whoa, like they've reversed Rett in some animals?
Yes. So Adrian Bird, who's a very famous scientist, and he's on our board of trustees. He's at the University of Edinburgh. He's the one that discovered MECP2, the protein, back in the early 90s. He made the first animal models. And then in 2007, he published a very critical paper that I think really changed the way scientists, researchers, think about Rett syndrome, and offered a lot of hope for the families, myself included. He published a paper. So he designed there's lots of different animal models for Rett syndrome, mice models. He designed a mouse model of Rett where he was able to silence the MECP2 gene and then turn it back on at will by giving the mouse a drug that interacts with something in the cell and that turns on the MECP2 gene. It's called a conditional mouse. It uses something called Crelux. He didn't invent the genetic tool that allowed him to do this. It's a tool that a lot of researchers use to answer questions about what happens if I turn off this gene, or what happens if I turn it back on. And so it's a tool that's available. He used it. He was able to turn on the gene at will. And what we learned is through his experiment, which has then been replicated and done many, many times in lots of different labs, so if a mouse with no MECP2 gene gets Rett symptoms, Rett-like symptoms in a mouse, when you turn the gene back on at any time in the lifespan of a mouse, you could do it early on in a baby mouse, or in a, let's say, adult mouse, or in an old mouse who's never had MECP2. Doesn't matter when you turn the gene back on, the symptoms go away.
Wow.
Every symptom that is measurable, that they've been measured, has gone back almost to normal mouse levels. So that's encouraging. Now, people are not mice, and we didn't, for example, look at communication in a mouse. So they don't speak, and so not everything was tested, but it's encouraging. And now we'll get a first opportunity with these trials to see what might happen when we try to replicate what Adrian did in a mouse model using a technology that we can actually use in people, gene therapy.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to go from zero to a cure necessarily in these first trials. But there may be some incremental steps that have to happen, but it's the first opportunity that we've had to actually address the disease by trying to target the root cause.
And right now for autism, there isn't one gene there,
Right.
but there are like 100 or so
Yep.
genes that are more predictive, and like Fragile X has a gene.
Yep.
Rett has a gene, and these kids, tubular sclerosis, they have a,
TSC. Yep.
yeah. So, and these populations tend to have autism or autism-like symptoms. So, so I think it's important that the autism
Step forward.
community, that we are in tune to this. Like, I've interviewed a researcher from Spark, which is the biggest research organization for autism, and we can link that in the show notes. This is going to be episode 239. So marybarbera.com/239. We can link an episode I did with a really famous researcher in the autism world, Catherine Lord. We've had researchers on the show, like I said, but this is really exciting to have you on the show, Monica, talking about Rett, because it is one gene with several, dozens of mutations on that gene. But it's exciting to hear that there's actually human trials going on with genetic therapy.
Yeah, and gene therapy. So this is these trials are using very traditional gene therapy. So you're adding extra copies of a gene, injecting it into the body to compensate for a mutated gene. We're also pursuing other strategies like gene editing, where you're not adding an extra copies of a gene, but you're actually fixing the mutation. We're looking at RNA editing. We're looking to try to reactivate the MECP2 gene that's on the inactive X. So we're pursuing a number of strategies. And I think in time, there isn't going to be a single cure for Rett or, significant treatment. We'll see what it ends up being. But I think in time, there's going to be multiple. There's going to be traditional gene therapy. There's going to be DNA editing. There's going to be RNA editing. And some will be mutation specific. Some will be generic, should be applicable to all mutations. It's exciting.
Yeah.
And our focus at the Rett Syndrome Research Trust is genetic medicines. We're focused at, we're lucky enough that we have a single gene. We know what our target is. And we think that the likelihood of getting the most dramatic improvements that we want in our children is by addressing the root cause of the disease. So that's really our focus, genetic medicines.
Nice. So where can people find out more about Rett and about your research foundation?
Sure. So the name of my foundation is the Rett Syndrome Research Trust. ReverseRett.org is our URL, or you can just Google Rett Syndrome Research Trust.
Nice.
And there's a lot of information. We have a YouTube channel, a lot of interviews with scientists, how-to kind of videos, explainer videos.
What is the recommendation? Like, I have a 27-year-old son with autism.
Yeah.
I don't think he has Rett, but like, when should kids with autism be evaluated to get blood testing to see if they have Rett?
So the average age that children are being diagnosed with Rett is around 2. And, we're getting to the point where we don't even necessarily need a doctor to say to himself, maybe this is Rett, let me test for it. Now kids are getting whole genome sequencing, whole exome sequencing, or they're getting certain panels, neurodevelopmental panels, where they're just being screened for a number of disorders all at the same time. And as the cost of sequencing comes down, I think anytime a child presents to a neurologist, it's mostly neurologists that are making the diagnosis, not pediatricians.
And probably developmental pediatricians.
In our case, it's typically neurologists, but anytime a child shows up with developmental delay or regression, is when that testing is happening. So they're getting diagnosed pretty young.
Yeah. And if you have an older child, especially a girl with, some more motor delays or, they're getting worse. I mean, are people going and saying, hey, I want to just have my older child screened for Rett?
Yes.
As well?
I do hear from parents who have older children who have had an autism diagnosis, but it never felt quite right to the parents. Like, their child is different than the other autistic kids. And just, I would urge them to, go talk to your doctor and order a test for Rett syndrome, or get whole exome sequencing, or a neurodevelopmental panel. Those are out there. They're typically covered by insurance and worth pursuing.
Yeah. All right. Excellent advice, Monica. So before I let you go, part of my podcast goals are not to just help the kids, but also to help the parents and professionals who are listening be less stressed and lead happier lives. So I know you're stressed caring for your daughter, running a research foundation. Do you have any self-care tips or stress management tools that you use to try to ease your stress?
Oh my God, I am such a bad person to ask this question to, because I am the poster child of what not to do for self-care. But I will say, okay, so I'll give you something that I've just started doing, like as of this week. my neck and my shoulders have been just so painful from, I think, from stress and from lifting, and just because I have arthritis in my neck. And my daughter goes to a wonderful massage therapist, who she's been seeing for a number of years, and she has 2 sessions a week, 90-minute sessions. And I can see I can see that it really, really helps. And she needs massage therapy from the tip of her head to her toes. Every part of her body is affected. But I've started seeing the massage therapist and making a point of trying to squeeze in an hour massage either before or after my daughter when the therapist is available. Because I just recognize if I don't start taking care of myself, I'm going to be in trouble because I won't be able to lift her at all. And we just had the first session last week. She's done little 5, 10, 15-minute things here and there, but had an hour session on Monday, and I feel it, just one session. So I'm going to try to go once a week for the next several months to see if I can actually make an impact, because I'm losing strength in this arm too, because I think the nerves are affected. And I think massage can be if you're seeing a good therapist and PT, but I'm going to start with massage.
Nice.
So that's my self-care tip.
I love it. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to hear all the advances in Rett, and I'll look forward to maybe you can come back in a year or two or whenever, once we get some human trial data. I think it's
great.
Super exciting. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for having me. And best of luck to all of your listeners and with their children.